Candace. So excited to be here today.
Yes, thank you, Jodi. Episode 3, we're on a
Woohoo!
roll.
We are, and our audience is increasing daily, and I love it. And super excited to be doing this episode during Pride Month.
Absolutely. I was going to say happy Pride, but I know that, one of the conversations we had recently is Pride should be every month. But
Right.
nonetheless, I'm glad that at least there is an opportunity here to educate ourselves, or certainly me and our audience.
Yeah, it's I think I like that. I like to see Pride Month as the opportunity for visibility. Um, because otherwise I look at it, I'm like, oh yeah, happy Pride. Well, okay, but I'm queer the whole year, right? Not just this one month.
Not
Um,
just in June.
right. But I maybe it's this time that we create this sort of bubble of like, I'm going to say protection, that it feels okay to come out or it feels more celebratory. And that's great. I hope that we can engender that all year round. But the fact that we have kind of developed this little bubble where that of time that is more celebrated is great.
Absolutely. And, that sort of segues into what our episode is going to be this week, which is in honor of our Pride Month, is I'm coming out. And it takes a village. So we're going to talk about how we support our loved ones, particularly our kids, when they decide to come out as LGBTQ um, plus. So let's talk about the best way to support our loved ones, Jodi. And, just give me a second here, because to our audience, I want them to know that in addition to your being a highly skilled family law attorney in New York and New Jersey, you have a Master of Science in Child and Adolescent Development Psychology. And I think that that's such a beautiful sort of mark for you to show your commitment to the health and the welfare of the child, particularly when you're practicing in family law. And so I do think this gives you a little bit of credibility to talk about things like how we support our children when they come out.
No, I appreciate that. And I will tell you, I got my master's not because I needed to, right? I had already been practicing law for 15 or so years, but because I wanted to, right? Because I was doing guardian ad litem work or attorney for the child work. And I was like, I want to understand this more. Not like I need to. The court would still appoint me, but I wanted to understand it more. And I ended up focusing a lot on trauma and neurobiological issues. But my final capstone was actually in gender affirmation um, of LGBTQ children in custody situations. And in custody situations and not in custody situations, it's the same, like in disputes or not in disputes. The concepts of supporting your child are the same, just it
Yeah.
adds an extra element if you've got an additional dispute on top of the need to support your LGBTQIA plus child.
Right. I mean, I think that that's right. And, I think one of the things that we should probably start by saying for this episode is that coming out in whatever form, in whatever manner, to whomever is brave. It takes courage, it takes energy, it takes thought. And so we just want to remind our listeners, any parents out there, just to be mindful of this as they kind of go through the motions of what maybe their family will now sort of go through and take as their path, with hopefully a lot of good advice from you, Jodi, on the best way to do so. So let's get started. Let's talk about the pivotal role that parents play in our children coming out.
I think that the first thing people need to understand is that if your child is telling you that they are gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, trans, non-binary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's because they trust you, right? They're not
Yeah.
going to tell you something if they don't trust you.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot for a child to be able to do that. And this is a child, there's a misconception that a child has to be a teenager to come out, right? Or an adult to come out. Gender identity actually develops between 1.5 and 3 years of age. And people are
Wow.
like, what? But well, how do they even know? Because it's not something that you have to learn. right? It's something that's innate. And but sometimes kids don't actually express it because they don't, I'm going to say need to, because they don't
Sure.
feel the dysphoria
Sure.
um, until their body starts to change. They become less androgynous, right? Or they're being, like they're being required to wear clothing that doesn't feel right to them. So that's why sometimes you'll see it appear at various stages, because it depends on the environment that surrounds that child and what they're actually going through for the right timing for them. And
That
sexual
makes sense.
orientation develops around 9 years of age.
Okay.
So when people say, "Oh, my child's 12, they don't know anything about their sexuality yet," I'm like, yeah, they do. And I mean, 12 is actually, I think, when we were kids, maybe at 12 we were thinking about our first crush, but now at 12, kids are far more um, relationship savvy than perhaps we were at that age. But and they're aware of their feelings, right? So saying like
Sure.
they don't know what they don't know yet really ignores that they have these feelings inside, and that's okay, right?
Yeah.
And it's okay. Just because you have a sexuality doesn't mean you're acting on it, right? Those are two different um, things. We help our children understand the safety of sexual activity, which is completely different than your gender identity or your sexual orientation.
Sure. And so I think what's interesting in what you just said in a way that you summarized through, a child voicing who they happen to be is the listening piece, right? And I think that is key, that by being available to your child, it already means that they trust you, and your job is to listen to them.
Right. And I think that actually starts and the modeling starts way before your kid might have that conversation with you. Because, your kids are growing up from, the moment they're born, listening to the things you have to say, listening to the things that happen around you. And so it's important to think ahead, right?
Sure.
You may have a 3-year-old, but if you're saying something negative about any particular community or any particular identity, then that's going to be in their back of their heads as they get older.
Yeah, and maybe
So it's
internalized,
right,
right,
right, which may also impact how soon they come out, whether they feel safe with you, et cetera. And that
yeah,
can have a huge impact on a parent-child relationship.
yeah,
So one of the things that's super important is, and it's I hate saying this, but statistics, right? I talk about statistics all the time. And the Trevor Project is a phenomenal organization that that produces a national survey on LGBTQ mental health on a regular basis. And they just did one in the fall of 2022. And the thing that I want to start this whole conversation with is that, and I'll use trans and non-binary kids for the purposes of this. There are 53% of trans and non-binary kids have seriously considered death by suicide in the past
oh,
12 months.
devastating.
With parental acceptance and support, that number drops to 6%.
Wow, what an incredible statement that is.
It is mind blowing to me when people are like, well, I don't know. I don't know if I could support them. I don't understand this. I'm like, this is the difference between life and death. And
Literally.
so I like hashtag Trevor Project, love the Trevor Project. I actually wrote an article for the American Bar Association for a publication that'll be coming out soon based on one of the Trevor Project's analyses in their survey, which was like the 5 things you can do to support your LGBTQ plus kid. And I love it because it's
Yeah,
like a capsule size. And
sure.
that's like a perfect thing for people to be able to walk around with and like absorb, because it's not rocket science. It's unnecessarily politicized, but the concepts are super basic and attainable for parents or for people supporting a child.
Well, I think it's interesting that you say that it's basic because I'm sure that a lot of people who are going through it, it doesn't feel basic. It
For
feels
sure.
scary for many parents. You're in uncharted territory. I would say that most parents think that they're doing the best that they can for their kids. And so I think it's important for our audience to know that this really is sort of about imparting the best information for you, not to make you feel judged. But we're trying to give you the best resources of information so that you can best support your child because statistics like that, Jodi, are devastating. I mean, I
Right.
don't think there's another word for it. Having looked at the Trevor Project myself, which is such a beautiful and an incredible resource, I think one of the things that I read was that only about a third of kids who identify as LGBTQI plus felt that their home was affirming.
Yeah.
So one of the first steps, it seems to me, that a parent can make is that support piece just
Right.
to make them feel safe. And then all of these other tips that we're going to give you that, like, as you put it, you can walk around with. And listen, you're going to practice these things, right? No
Right.
one's perfect.
And
And
nobody
if you,
knows it innately, right? Even I had to learn these
absolutely,
things. And if you grow up in a space where that's not part of your your life, that's not
sure.
part of your everyday thinking, then that's a problem because you have to learn it as an
Yeah.
adult in order
But
to
not a
support your
problem.
child. No,
It's
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 not a problem. It's a
something.
challenge.
Yeah,
Right?
it's a challenge. And I think that, we all love our kids. And it's certainly, as a parent, a challenge that anyone who does love their child and wants them to feel loved and safe and secure, and they want to feel affirmed, that these are things that you can do to make that happen. So let's get into it. We already talked about listening, right? That's step number one. The information you just gave us, that this information could come out a heck of a lot younger than maybe you think it would come from
Yeah.
your child. So you have to listen and think about what they're saying to you.
Yeah, and one of the things that people also conflate is gender identity versus sexual orientation, right?
Okay.
And they're different. So
Yes. So
gender
tell us about
identity
that.
is who you are, your innate sense of self, right?
Okay.
Your sexual orientation is who you are attracted to,
Got
right?
it.
Or not attracted to if you're asexual. But so it's completely different from each other and not dependent upon each other. So
Absolutely.
it's two different things. So maybe the parent of someone coming out as a lesbian or as pansexual may um, not be able to exactly relate to a parent of a child coming out as non-binary or trans because it's a different feeling, it's a different experience. So
Sure.
it's important not to, we do kind of group them all together, but we want to make sure that that, you know, to well, I'm going to skip right to like number 5 on my list, right, which is educate yourself about LGBTQ people and issues, because that's really important to understand. Because to support something, right, you really have to be able to understand it and be open to learning about it.
Yeah. Well, let's go back then to the beginning. So after we're in a position where our child trusts us enough to share with us maybe what they're going through, whether it's the sexual orientation, their identification, whatever the case may be for your particular situation. What do you say as a parent? Do you, say thank you for sharing and thank you for trusting me? It can it be that simple, Jodi?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's great. That's a great way to approach it. And parents can have their own feelings, but that's not the moment for that to be expressed. It's
Got it.
also not something, it's important for parents to remember, it's not something they get to decide or they get to approve of, right? It's just something that is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not, help me make this decision, mom, right? It's, this is who I am.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
so if a parent comes back at that and says, well, I need to think about that and we have to talk about this further because I have to consider whether that's good for you, right? Which we might say in some other situation, um, that's that's not where this conversation should be going. If it is a shock, okay, right? Say, wow, okay, wasn't expecting that. Um, I support you. I love you. I want to learn more, right? I want
Right.
to understand more. I love you no matter what,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So even
We
if
used
you
to joke
are
that my kid would have
taken
to come out to me as straight, right?
Right. So, as our listeners know, we both have very different families from each other in some ways, in other ways, quite similar. Um, but, I think you're right. I think, having the experience in your own family, perhaps in your family, it would be less surprising than in other families, right? Not because you expect it, but because you've already lived it. So it
Right.
doesn't feel so maybe momentous in your family, and others maybe it could. I don't
Yeah.
know.
No,
Um,
I think that's true. I mean, it was like my own coming out, which didn't happen until I was in my mid 30s, um,
yeah,
was because I think it was delayed because I didn't know such an identity existed,
makes
right?
sense.
So if a kid grows up in an environment where all identities and orientations are celebrated, it is much easier for them to, like you said, it might be easier in that family. So in my family, kids are going to know that that is just, I'm going to say, part of daily rhetoric, right? It's part of
And it's
things we talk about,
okay. And it's
and it's fine.
okay.
And in
Yeah,
other
yeah.
families, it may be fine with the parents. They may be supportive, but it just may not have been part of the daily conversation, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think life and experience informs your opinion about things. So if the kids don't see a lot of examples of sort of differences in that way, there might be a presumption that there isn't support when in fact there is. So,
Right,
I mean, I think that that's really hopeful that just because it's not something you're familiar with doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be this, incredibly difficult struggle for your family. Because if you keep going back to step one, which is I love you and I
right,
want you to feel supported, so you're not in this awful statistic where you're worrying about the life and death of your child, let's figure out how to do this in the healthiest way. And we're creating a really good foundation. So, I think what you've said really is you're talking about a dialogue, right? Which
right,
I think is probably sort of tip number two in our discussion, right? Listening and keeping it simple and just saying thank you and I'm here and I love you and I'm proud of you, and then go through and really commit to an ongoing dialogue. So can you talk a
right.
little bit about that, Jodi?
I can. You, the thing is that it's really important for parents to have their own resources. I get a ton of inquiries from people that are like, okay, my kid came out as trans, my kid came out as pansexual. What do I do? How do I support them? And I love those inquiries. No, it doesn't have anything to do with my legal practice. Absolutely not. But I give people resources and different therapists that are LGBTQ informed, so that they can have those resources. But resources like PFLAG, right? Great resource for parents. Your child should not be your educator. That
Yeah.
is a really important piece here, right? So your open dialogue with your child is about how they feel, right? And your support for them and what you can do to help support them, but is not to learn about the actual identity or the actual orientation or the LGBTQ community. Your child should not be your professor, right? Your child,
Yeah.
you need to be their support. Um,
Well, let's
and
talk about
yeah,
the dialogue, right? So, particularly when you're talking about children who are finding themselves in general, I mean, their frontal cortexes of their brain are not developed to make good decisions about, driving a car too fast. So I think, in having that open dialogue, we have to give them space to figure it out and find the words for themselves and being able to discuss it with you. So the dialogue issue, Jodi, I want to make sure without spending too much time because I think it's pretty specific and unique to each person, each child. But can you just give us a little scoop about the best way to keep that open dialogue?
the first thing is to I think, realize that kids really accept what you tell them, right? So if you have a little one who, says, um, well, I don't understand. Um, how does Aunt Joan have a girlfriend and not a boyfriend, right? And your answer is, oh, well, you can have a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a friend, or you don't have, it doesn't matter whether it's a boy or a girl or neither. That's just who your friend is, and that's okay. The kid will go, oh, all right,
Right.
right? Like, and it's no big deal. If you make it a big deal, they make it a big deal. It's like if your kid falls on the playground, right? And you're like, oh my God, are you okay? Then they're like, they get upset. But if you're like,
Yeah.
oh, wipe it off, let's go, you're okay, look how big you are, then they're fine.
Yeah.
So if, as parents, sometimes we make a big deal of something that's not actually a big deal
That makes sense.
to children. And if they're really little, let them have their own voice, right? So you have a little kid that comes to you and says, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. You're and if you are not, in a family that experiences this every day, you're probably going to be shocked, right? And you're going to be like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Um, and but in that moment, it's okay to just say, okay, honey, let's talk about that more, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
Yeah.
And so just try to understand your child. And then if they say, the next day, they might say, well, I'm a boy today. You're like, okay, just
Yeah.
kind of go with it.
Just go with it and
Just
follow
go
their
with it.
lead.
Follow
Keep
their
it an
lead,
open dialogue.
right?
Right.
And
Okay. Well,
that follow their lead is pretty much for any age,
yeah.
right?
That
Yeah,
makes sense. I mean, so, you know, the next issue that I think cannot be overstated enough is support.
right.
Because at the end of the day, unless you're Jodi Argentino, and you have your master's in, adolescent psychology, child psychology, we're not experts. And even in preparing for this episode, Jodi, right, we both consulted a lot of really good resources and material, to make sure that we're offering our listeners the support, the expert support that may be needed. So, what are your thoughts about the next best place to go? You're listening, you're keeping it simple, you're affirming who they are, you're keeping the open dialogue, you're sort of
Right.
entering into this space. What's the next step? Where do you get the support?
Not on Reddit, right? Like, not randomly from something you might Google, because you don't know what the source of that is, right? And we
Sure.
don't want necessarily fake news. We want to actually go to the American Academy of Pediatrics, to WPATH, which is the World Health Organization, to your an affirming pediatrician, to the website for Trevor Project, to the website for Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Sexual Orientation Gender Identity Clinic, right? You want to go to known quantities. Within those, like, if you're a professional in this, you have, like, I have a book of stuff, right? Like, I have articles, I have research there on everything. So phone a friend, right? Someone
Yeah.
you know that is in the community, someone that you know has a connection to the community, and you can get those resources. You can talk to PFLAG, you can talk to Glisten. There's so much out there, but the problem is there's so much bad information too, right?
Yeah.
And so, and so one of the things I want to just go a little bit less about getting information, right, and a little bit more about not just talking to your child, but talking about your child. And that's talking respectfully about your child's LGBTQ identity. Opening your home to your child's LGBTQ friends and partners, right? So it's not necessarily just getting the information and saying the words, right? It's about creating the affirming environment.
Yeah.
Because if you say, hey, have all your friends over, and then your kids' friends leave, and you're like, wow, that kid was really weird, huh? And you're automatically making a judgment of a friend group that reflects your own child.
Yeah,
So
and so now, you're sort of segueing into our next topic, which is how to be an ally. But if we could just go back for those of us who don't have the access to information and experts, I mean, do you think as someone with her master's and all things being equal, presuming that, one has insurance and access to professionals, do you think it's a good idea to then seek out the sort of consult of the pediatrician and talk to your pediatrician about perhaps having your child see a therapist about coming out and to make sure that they feel supported? Is that one of the steps that you would recommend?
Absolutely, if your child needs to have that discussion, right? Not every child is at a point where they have dysphoria or they have pain about their identity. Sometimes they just want to sit with it and know that you are okay with it and know that you support it before having to analyze it, right?
Okay, so that's interesting.
Yeah,
But they don't necessarily have to be quote unquote in pain or, be in maybe in a personal crisis. But sort of, I guess it goes back to the open dialogue and
right.
following their lead, where if you do, I guess with any other issue as a parent, if you see your child maybe having some troubles working their way through it, whether it's just adolescence and, interpersonal relationships with their friends on the playground, to something that is much more impactful in their life, gender identity, sexual preference or orientation, that sort of thing. So a therapist doesn't necessarily have to be the first call. Is that right?
That is correct. I'm gonna stick a pin in you for 1 second, Candace, because I will tell you that I would advocate to never use the term sexual preference,
Oh, okay.
um, because sexual preference means it's a choice,
Got it.
and it is not a
Thanks.
choice. And
Yes.
this is a perfect example, right? We're having this conversation, and this happens all the time. I talk to people, and they say something. I'm like, "Oh, you know what?" They say, "Oh, my transgendered child," right? And I'm like, "Okay, let's take that ed off the end there because it is an adjective. It's not a noun, right?" We need to make sure that we're using that language, and that's
Yeah.
actually perfectly segues right into one of the other Trevor Project's 5 points, which is talk respectfully about LGBTQ identity. And
Sure.
you want to make sure that you're using the language, but you're like, where do I find that language? How do I get that language? Well, you listen to podcasts, right? But there's a lot of really good resources out there where you can find a list of what works and what doesn't work with regard to language. And or asking, right? The
Yeah.
intent is actually more important than the words, right?
I mean, I
So,
think that you're right. So, one of the things we just talked about was, making sure that you're using affirming language to make them feel loved and supported. And in so doing, you want to make sure that you don't misstep with certain words that may cause someone harm or discomfort. And it can turn into a teaching moment.
yeah,
Just like you are teaching me, right?
right.
And
And it's
um,
better to have a teachable moment. Always better to have a teachable moment. So this goes with pronouns too, right? So chosen names and pronouns. The effect on children of using their pronouns and chosen names is enormous when it comes to their mental health. And that's, people will say, oh, well, I just can't remember that. But that's BS because you remembered it the first time. You can remember the change, right? You remember the name of everybody that you meet that in a class that you teach. You're going to, it is really not that much harder to remember the pronoun of the child that you see all the time. But if you mess up, right, it's okay so long as you acknowledge that you messed up and that
sure.
you're going to do better, right? And that you're going to try harder and that you don't just keep messing up and blowing it off because
Yeah.
that's the insult, right?
Yeah. Well, it's
That's the
important,
problem,
right? And it's about loving and supporting the person.
right?
And, when you say that you're sorry, they still feel loved and supported, even if you do use the wrong word in a way that I just did just now.
Right.
And I think, you know, bringing up the pronoun issue and the support issue goes back into allyship and how those of us who may not um, identify as LGBTQIA, but love someone who is, and I would venture to guess that's most of our audience. How do we make sure that we are allies? I mean, one of the things that we talked about at the top of this episode is that your child is watching you. They're listening to you. They're
Yep.
watching what you do and what you say. So, you made the point of inviting your child's friends over to your safe, supportive home is one of the simplest things that
Right.
you can do as a parent.
Create that safe space. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to invite them over and have all rainbow balloons and rainbow paper plates and rainbow napkins and like be walking around talking about every gay person you ever knew, right? Like it's not. It just means having a home where that's off the table, where people just come in and their friends just get to hang out. And if they're wearing nail polish, great. And if they're um, wearing a dress, great. You're not going to look at them sideways. You're not going to make a comment about it. You're just going to be welcoming in your home. And the community, right? We talk about the systems. When somebody comes out, there's all of these different systems in their life. There's a family system, there's a peer system, school system, society, right? And so this kid has to navigate all of those different spaces. So if they at least have that one safe space that you have control over, right? I don't have control over what society is doing or what Alabama's up to or what nonsense Florida has come up with now, right? Like I don't have control over that. But I do have control over my own home and the people I expose my children to on a regular basis. And that's the important piece. I'm going to tell you this little anecdote as we're sort of wrapping up, but um, so I have twins and they just turned 10 the day before yesterday. And the and my daughter made herself a superhero costume out of, I don't know, a paper bag, some sticks, and some paper. She made a mask. She made like a quiver and a bow and arrow and some string. It's amazing.
Cool.
And she's like, Mom, I am a superhero. I am going to be a superhero. I don't know what my superhero name is yet. Her brother has now named it, but I don't know what it is yet. But I know that what she does is she fights for the LGBTQIA community and protects people. And I got chills and I was like, that's awesome. So
That
she
is
has since designed
beautiful.
the entire costume.
Yeah.
And she's like, I'm taking this costume with me and it's this little paper mask and she's
Yeah.
adorable. But, and so, I think we as parents, we can be that superhero for our kids, right? Because we can make sure that the people surrounding them are supportive. And
Absolutely.
I was like, look at you go. You little thing want to be out there and I could give you a list of names who my 10-year-old has decided she's going to shoot arrows to change their opinions. It's amazing, like an LGBTQ woke Cupid, my child.
I love it.
um, but it's really that energy, right?
Yeah.
And that like unconditional, like, okay, we're going to provide an environment that I may not understand, but I am damn well going to make sure that you feel loved and want to be alive.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the
What a low
very
bar that
least.
is.
I know. And I think though, Jodi, what what it comes down to is back to the basics of what this podcast is about. How we care for the people that we love, and we want to care for them in the best way for them. And
Yeah.
that means accepting who they are and allowing them to come as they are and loving them for that. And I think that one of the things that I hope that our listeners take away from this is there is such a large community of support, and we're definitely going to be posting our resources for you as a parent or a family member or someone who loves someone who might be coming out, whether in June or in December, because you don't need just 1 month for Pride. I think, as you said,
Like Christmas
pretty
in July, we have
eloquently, yeah,
Pride in December.
it should be all year round that, we have to provide that love and that support so that our children feel the love and support and they're not part of a statistic that I don't even want to repeat. Um,
Yeah.
and as far as, your daughter goes and what her aspirations are, that is really just a beautiful kind of moment, and it gives me hope, right? That this
Yeah.
next generation sees things in a much more inclusive and loving way.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a proud mommy moment. Right. And
Yeah,
this is
that
a
is
kid
for
that wants to
sure.
be an entomologist. Like we're not talking about a kid who normally dresses up as superheroes. And it's amazing to feel that energy. And I think that's what Pride gives us. That's what Pride Month gives us. It gives us that energy that feels like we can do this. We can be our authentic selves, and we can support those around us to be their authentic self. And that's I
I
think
love
that's a
that.
core of of caring for everyone around you.
Yes, absolutely. On that note, I think that, look, Jodi, we are available obviously for any questions, and we're happy to share with you all of our resources. So thank you for tuning in for our third episode.